Hi everyone, we are going to get started. To briefly introduce myself, I am Chloe, a Jewish British university student studying politics in France, and I am also behind the platform International Voices for Change, the co-organiser of today's webinar. International Voices for Change is part of the fight of combating anti-Semitism through education. Unfortunately, the academic institutions we rely on to do just that fail the majority of the Jewish people, those of us who consider Zionism an integral part of our Judaism. Universities fan the flames of anti-Zionism, contemporary anti-Semitism, by, for example, giving a free pass to professors who teach hate, legitimising anti-Semitic incidents on campus as free speech, and taking part in the academic boycott of Jews and Israelis, which have all created a toxic, dangerous, and divisive environment for Jewish students globally. There is also an issue beyond academic institutions. People are being indoctrinated with anti-Jewish hatred from public platforms and voices, for example, Louis Farrakhan and Wiley, or in politics where anti-Semitic progressive politicians are dangerously idolised, for example, Jeremy Corbyn and his comrades in the Labour Party, or representatives in the Democratic Party, such as Ilhan Omar and Linda Sarsour, among others, or some supporters of anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter, which advocate for important objectives of racial justice and judiciary reform, but also embrace the anti-Semitic boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and falsely single out Israel in its founding charter with an absurd accusation of genocide. Anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric in the public sphere from both sides of the political spectrum has fired up harassment, intimidation, violence, vandalism and murder against Jews, both online and in the streets, from university campuses to synagogues to anti-race protests to Twitter. Both Jews and non-Jews need to have inclusive and constant conversations. We need to overcome ignorance and drive education through the provision of tools to enable such change. We need to reclaim the narrative to ensure the safety, rights, and freedoms of the Jewish people, and this webinar will provide the foundations in which to do so. I am now going to pass over to Avi Weinryb, the Deputy Director of the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, who will be moderating today's panel.
Thanks a lot, Chloe. Your leadership is deeply appreciated. The Combat Anti-Semitism Movement is proud to be partnering with you today on today's program. Welcome, everyone. I'm Avi Weinryb, Deputy Director of the Combat Anti-Semitism Movement. We're a nonpartisan global grassroots movement of 280,000 individuals and 265 organizations and growing across all religions and faiths, united to combat anti-Semitism. Today, we are honored to have four fantastic speakers joining us to help us better understand the unique nature and dangers of contemporary anti-Semitism and what we can all do to address it. And we've all seen the troubling statistics. Anti-Semitism has risen and continues to rise around the world, emanating from the right, the left, political Islam, and everywhere in between. Jews and Jewish institutions are getting physically attacked on the streets, verbally attacked online. Social media has become a space for advancing conspiracy theories, Holocaust denial and Holocaust trivialization, and advancing attacks on Israel's legitimacy and existence. Jews are getting pushed out of progressive spaces, being informed that they have Jewish privilege, and having anti-Semitism redefined for them by non-Jews, and told their homeland is a mistake that must cease existing. And the toxicity we've seen online does not stay there, as demonstrated by internet-inspired shootings at synagogues in the US, Germany, and beyond. The challenges are great. I have the honor of welcoming our four panelists today. Joining us is David Hirsh, sociology professor at Goldsmiths University of London. He is the co-founder of Engage, a campaign against the academic boycott of Israel. He authored the book Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, which examines case studies of openly anti-Semitic discourse, which have emerged out of anti-Semitism. Also joining us is Rudy Rochman, who experienced his first anti-Semitic hate crime at 7 years of age when he was forced off a bus with his family because they were visibly Jewish. This strengthened his resolve to become an advocate for the Jewish people. After serving as an IDF paratrooper, he founded a grassroots pro-Israel movement on campus at Columbia University, students supporting Israel. He's leader of the grassroots movement Habayit, which unites Israeli and Palestinian activists. And online, he creates educational content with the aim of shifting the political and ideological conversation regarding the Jewish people in Israel. Also joining us is Olga Meshoe-Washington. Olga Meshoe-Washington was born in South Africa and raised by her parents in a Christian Zionist home. Her father, Keith Meshoe, his exposure to the BDS movement while visiting the US was the fuel for her Israeli activism. Olga is a unique, inspiring voice for Israel, an attorney by profession, a proud Israel advocate and educator, and she's also the CEO of DEISI, Defend, Educate, Invest in, and Support Israel. And last but not least, also joining us is Yoni Michanie. Yoni Michanie, a former IDF paratrooper. So half our speakers are former paratroopers. Very cool. Is a writer, speaker, and Jewish Israel activist who addresses the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of academia based on his personal experiences. He's currently pursuing his PhD in political science. So a few housekeeping items before we actually jump into things. Thank you for your patience, everyone. So number one, please be advised, this program is on the record. We are being live streamed to social media platforms. This is very much a public event. We're going to begin with David, followed by Rudy, then Olga, and then Yoni. Each will have approximately 7 minutes or so for their initial remarks, and we'll then open things up to questions from our audience. For those of you joining us on Zoom, thank you. Great to have you here. Please use the question feature below. For those watching on Facebook, you can submit your questions as a comment, and we will do our best to address as many as possible. And with that, I'm going to ask David to please start us off. But of course, first, I must unmute him.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. So I wanted to start really, I was thinking about my book, it was published in 2018, which is called Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism. And my book really is a story of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism on the left. Interestingly, I think you can find a moment in about 2001 when anti-Semitism suddenly comes back. It's a moment just following what may turn out to have been the end of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's a moment in which Durban was a huge kind of symbolic turning point, where the question at Durban at the great big UN and NGO conference was where does the global fight against racism go after the defeat of apartheid South Africa? And one of the answers that was given very clearly at Durban was it turns to Zionism, that Zionism becomes the central racism on the planet, and therefore the central issue that all good people should address as a racism. And the following week after Durban was a kind of symbolic of the re-emergence of jihadi.
David, I
politics.
apologize. We're getting some feedback from your headphones. Everyone can hear it. Can you make sure your connections are tight? Or maybe you're leaning too close to another device. We were all getting a lot of feedback. Yeah. If there's a...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's getting a little bit of static, but we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. Stop me again if there's a problem. So following the week after Durban was 9/11, of course, a kind of huge symbolic moment, the re-emergence of jihadi Islamism. So my experience as being somebody who was in a trade union, in a sociology department, who was really knocking around the British left, was that anti-Semitism re-emerged into my universe. And the story in the book really is about the growth of the boycott movement within the academic trade unions and how we fought against that, but how in the end we were very unsuccessful. People embraced anti-Semitic politics without knowing it. They thought that they were the community of good people, and really what they were doing was drawing upon things that were in the culture, and in the culture of the left in particular, which were highly problematic. Because these people thought of themselves as the community of the good, one of the ways of dealing with anyone who stood up against anti-Semitism or against the boycott movement or against the demonization of Israel was to cast you as being outside of the community of the good. So if you would say, I'm a bit worried about the anti-Semitism that I have experienced, then the standard response would be, this person is talking about anti-Semitism, but really what they're trying to do is to prohibit criticism of Israel, to delegitimize it, to silence criticism of Israel. And so there was always this battle over framing, really. You can talk about the anti-Semitism that you experience, and it gets framed as a wish to clamp down on free speech and people who wish to side with human rights and the rest of it. So that becomes very familiar. So we failed to defeat it really in the academic union, and then in the unions more generally, and then in the Labour Party. And it became a huge political issue in Britain, culminating with a kind of quite serious bid for number 10 Downing Street. In the end, that was defeated, but at some cost. And I want to move on from having introduced the problem of left anti-Semitism that I have experienced and written about, to thinking about the problem in politics more generally, because I don't think left anti-Semitism could become plausible and popular and interesting unless there was something more profound wrong with the political culture in democratic states. I think the word populism is very useful to think about the connections between the rise of a certain kind of problematic and anti-democratic politics on the left, and a kind of similar mirror image of that anti-democratic and angry and furious politics, which has also arisen on the right. I don't think you could have had Corbyn without the Brexit movement in Britain. I don't think you would have some of the, I think in America, I think the populists on both the right and the left kind of rise up and reinforce each other. And one of the ways in which they do that is that they agree on certain fundamental issues. They agree that the democratic state is fundamentally fake. And they agree that there is a sort of liberal elite which runs everything kind of secretly, which pretends to be on the side of the good, but really is only in the business of enriching itself. It's globalist, it's cosmopolitan, it's educated, it's elite, it's involved in finance capital, it's metropolitan, and it doesn't understand the ordinary people like you and me. And this is a kind of basic framework which is shared at the moment by a kind of furious, angry right-wing populism and a furious, angry left-wing populism. And what these two populisms tend to do is to reinforce each other and to make each other at least appear to be the only real opposition. So they agree that, ordinary liberal, what they denounce as centrists and centrist dads and all of that stuff are of the past and are of the problem. And we're going to fight over what we replace it with when we tear it all down. So the framework within which left anti-Semitism emerges is a framework in which a lot of its kind of fundamental feelings and fundamental beliefs are mirrored in other places in politics by people who would appear to be quite different from themselves. I think I've run out of time for the moment. Hope that I kicked off with something interesting that people can get their teeth into, and hope to get some interesting questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start my time, and 7 and 8 minutes is not so much to get into the topic of what is anti-Semitism, why is there anti-Semitism? So I'll focus first on what is anti-Semitism. But before that, I'll start on going over the story with my first experience that you mentioned earlier, When I was 7 years old, I had been born in France, moved to Israel, then moved to Miami. And I went to London with my mother and my younger brother to do a little tour of the city for the first time. We went on the double decker, the red tour bus. And as we got on the bus, my mom was wearing a shirt in Hebrew that said Emet. And she actually got it from Tzfat, which is a northern city in Israel. And the bus driver noticed my mom's shirt and he said, "Excuse me, is that written in Jewish?" I said, "No, it's written in Hebrew, but it's the language of the Jewish people, if that's what you're asking." I said, "Oh, so you guys are Jews?" And she's like, "Yeah, we're Jews. What's the problem?" I was like, "Get off my bus. I don't want any Jews there." And my mom, being a strong woman, refused to get off the bus. And he proceeded by getting up, grabbing my mom and throwing her off the bus. And that was my first experience with anti-Semitism, but the moment that taught me a lot. It also made me promise that the next time I deal with anti-Semitism, I'd be prepared physically, mentally, intellectually, and also ideologically. And that moment taught me who I was, because it didn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, resided in, or what passport I had, which were all different answers. It mattered that I was a Jew. And being a Jew is not my secondary identity based on my belief system. It's my primary and sole identity based on the descendants of the people and the collective that I come from. Now, in order to understand what is anti-Semitism, we also have to understand that there are many forms of xenophobias, of hatred or fears of different peoples, but each xenophobia plays out very differently. So racism against people of color, or homophobia, or Islamophobia, or all sorts of phobias or movements against peoples are expressed differently and have different experiences for those minorities that go through those day-to-day things. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, the formula is usually along the lines of finding the source of suffering and pain and trauma or evil that a community faces and blaming that on the Jewish people. It is also followed by usually minimizing the experience of the Jewish people, whether that be minimizing and pretending the Holocaust didn't happen, or pretending that Jewish people haven't suffered, or even making Jews seem as white, making them seem as they have not suffered throughout Europe, delegitimizing their identity. That also comes with making Jews white and claiming that they have no right to the land of Israel, delegitimizing their identity also in the sense of them not sort of having been indigenous to the land, but also comes with holding double standards and applying certain standards for the Jewish people and not applying those standards for others. But that also translates to things related to Israel. Now, what's unique to anti-Semitism is that we've sort of become the common enemy of all enemies. When you look at other forms of xenophobia, it's usually one or two groups that are against that specific group, and usually the extremes of those groups are those that are going to be against. But when it comes to the Jewish people, in every extreme of every community, somehow, somewhere, someone is blaming the problems of that community on the Jewish people, which is how it's translated today on college campuses. Now, a lot of people don't understand why anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. Well, first of all, we need to understand that Zionism is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their ancestral land. So if one were to be against the idea or the right for any other native population to self-determine on their ancestral land, example, the Tibetans, Aboriginals, Maoris, Native Americans, Native Canadians, Kurds, all sorts of native peoples around the land, that would be a form of being anti that people. There are many levels of xenophobia. One can be an extreme racist and want all people of color no longer to exist. One can be an extreme racist, but maybe a little bit less, and want all people of color to be segregated, and so on and so on. So the point is that there are different levels of racism, and that's the same thing when it comes to anti-Semitism. One may be okay with Jewish people living and being alive, but then being against their form of empowerment and against their right to self-determine in their ancestral land. And that's why anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, because it's a form of disempowering the Jewish people and removing them or removing their right from their land. Now, how is this expressed today on college campuses? Well, first of all, college campuses, university campuses are extremely important because they represent the future political and intellectual classes of the next generation. So those coming out of college campuses eventually grow up and go into positions of power: lawyers, doctors, people in the media, people in government, politicians. And so it's very important to make sure that that next generation coming out of university understands who the Jewish people are and can recognize what is anti-Semitic and fight against it when it comes up. So the way that anti-Semitism is spread today on a college campus, which a few of my co-panelists will touch on later on, is through something called intersectionality. The idea of intersectionality is basically uniting all sorts of minority movements in order to fight the oppressive power. But the way that certain student groups on college campuses are using intersectionality is they're going to every single minority group the Black Student Association, the Native American group, the Hispanic group, the LGBTQ plus group, the women's rights group, and they're finding the source of suffering that exists amongst those communities and saying this is not only the same thing that Israel does to the Palestinians, so you must fight with us and align with us to fight against the same power, but Israel's also producing this to your community and blaming Israel, for example, for police brutality, or comparing Native Americans, some white colonials came and stole our land, well, the Jews are a bunch of fake white people that came and stole our land, and trying to find these commonalities in order to get everyone to the conclusion that Israel doesn't only represent the same suffering that you've gone through, but is also the source of suffering. And again, like I said in the beginning, this is the formula for anti-Semitism, finding the source of suffering and cause of evil within a community and finding a way to blame that on the Jewish people. Now, the way we can fight against it, because the reality is that there is always going to be racism, there's always going to be anti-Semitism, there are always going to be people that are anti-women, any minority, and that's unfortunate. But it's important for the pop culture and the society to keep those voices and ideas down. And the way that you do that, if we look at an example, for example, racism, 80 years ago, you didn't have civil rights, you didn't have women's rights. How come today, when you come to a college campus, if someone is to say something racist or anti-women, right away, and justly so, they'd be rejected? And 80 years ago, that wasn't the case. Now, there are definitely still issues of systemic racism within certain white countries that have to be dealt with, but clearly there was an evolution amongst the past 80 years that has gotten to this point. And the reason they got to this point is because people of color created coalitions, created allies, women created coalitions, created allies, and fought to shift pop culture in the way they recognized what is wrong and what is right. So today, when you go to a college campus, an intellectual space, and someone says something anti-Black or anti-women, almost every single Black student is conditioned and prepared to rise above and deal with and fight against that racism, or every woman, mostly, is able to fight against it, and almost every other student is conditioned to sign with them. When it comes to anti-Semitism, most Jews don't say anything about it, and then we expect other people to do something about it. So the real question is, how do we rise above it? And how do we educate the next generation that influences pop culture to not only recognize it, but stand up and fight against it? And, you know, I'm up to my 8 minutes, but I have a few more points that maybe we'll go over in the Q&A as to why it exists and how do we continue from there.
Well, good day, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be with everyone on this panel. Chloe, once again, congratulations for having the courage to not only identify this problem of contemporary anti-Semitism as it filters itself across the world, but also taking a step forward in terms of doing something about it. It's also a privilege to speak with the likes of David, Rudy, as well as Yoni, whose work I respect. I've been asked to have a look at as to why the apartheid narrative, specifically as used by the BDS, is such a dangerous, even though it's also become a very important part of the anti-Semitic narrative as used by the BDS. Now, I unfortunately don't have time to go into the history of how the apartheid law found itself in the BDS movement, but I would like to take this opportunity as a South African whose family lived through it, whose ancestors lived through it, who also personally experienced it, to very briefly provide a definition of what apartheid was. If you have a look at the word apartheid, it literally means apartness. White people were told to be apart from non-white people. Oftentimes people only think of it as Black people, but it was anybody who wasn't white. Ladies and gents, the very purpose of us being apart, and we were put apart via over 150 laws that were institutionalized to ensure that we could have nothing to do with each other. And the reason for that, what informed that separation, ladies and gents, was moral as well as racial superiority. What do I mean? So the architects of apartheid in 1948, which is when it came into being, we're like, God made everybody, but when he made the non-whites, he didn't quite really finish his job. So non-whites don't have either the intellectual capacity to fully recognize or to fully appreciate all of their given talents. They are only useful for certain things. And those certain things all fell within the category of labor or being somebody else's worker. So ladies and gents, purely because of the color of our skin, as well as this whole notion of moral superiority, racial superiority, because of who Black people were, we could only work in certain places. And where we worked was also defined by where we could live. We had to have permission. as to where we could live, because we were not racially the same. We could only get education in a certain way. Why educate the Black person to attain the likes of becoming a lawyer or a judge or somebody in the economy? Because we just didn't have that capacity. And so we can look at these things. Over 150 laws even regulated who we could marry, who we could have relationships with. If we are going to be honest, intellectually honest, and we look at the state of Israel, ladies and gents, that doesn't exist. There would not have been a need for the liberation movement. We would not know the great Nelson Mandela like we know him today, if indeed Israel was an apartheid state. And so when they use this notion, they use it in order to demonize, to delegitimize the state of Israel, as well as the apartheid, the state of Israel, as well as the Jewish diaspora, excuse me. And so we then know that that equals anti-Semitism. So this whole apartheid lie, as found in the BDS, is anti-Semitic. Something else that I would like to bring to our attention. When we looked in the decades during apartheid and people marched in the streets, very passionate, and they raised their fists and they said, free, free South Africa, and we compare it today, when people go free, free Palestine, ladies and gents, the difference between those two chants of freedom was that during the Free South Africa era, the freedom that they were seeking was a dismantling of this oppressive system, the apartheid system, this government, these laws, and not the dismantling of this country or a people. But now, when we see this free, free Palestine, which oftentimes is followed by from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The reason for this chant, and so the reason for calling Israel an apartheid state, is not to see laws that supposedly exist dismantled. Ladies and gents, it's to see the dismantling of the Jewish state. And so those are two very, very different reasons with regards to what the BDS is saying Israel is an apartheid state and how apartheid South Africa existed. Also, if we look at the origins of the BDS movement, even though it found its formality, it was formalized in 2001, like David said, at the Durban conference, we could see aspects of this pre-1948. Pre the establishment of the Jewish state, pre even the existence of apartheid South Africa, when Arab leaders didn't want anything to do with Israel, when they did not want there to be a Jewish state, where they did not want there to be or have Jewish people have their own self-determination and have their own right to exist within their homeland. So all that's happened today is that BDS has taken on a different form, it's developed nicely, it's grown, it's morphed into what we see today, including, unfortunately, and even as Rudy alluded to, on our university campuses, not only here in the United States, although predominantly here, but also across the world. Now, the invoking of this Israel as an apartheid state narrative and equating it to the fact that if we want to see racial justice, if we want to see inequality sorted out, here in the United States with the Black American challenges, or anywhere else across the world, or even if we look at the Palestinian people, then we have to say that Israel is an apartheid state. The state of Israel has to be dismantled. And that is anti-Semitism in its absolute form. Now, as history tells us, and I'll say this in closing, anti-Semitism doesn't only hurt the Jewish community. It doesn't only end with them. We can look at Stalin, we can look at Hitler, and see that not only were the Jewish community impacted, but even those people outside of the Jewish community. So now, as the BDS finds itself in various movements for justice and various movements with racial inequality, they're doing nothing for the Palestinian people that they supposedly stand for. In fact, they're hurting them. And also hurting are Africans, Black South Africans, whose history has now been trivialized and used for somebody else's agenda that has got nothing to do with actually the empowerment of a people that are supposedly oppressed. But also now, having found itself in the United States as racial tensions exist, it's also hurting the Black community. So anti-Semitism is not only something that needs to be addressed because of the Jewish community, but addressed for humanity broadly.
No, I'm unmuted. That was great, Olga. And I'm gonna build off what you said, but before I start, I just want to give Chloe just an incredible shout out, as well as both International Voice for Peace and Combat Anti-Semitism, for putting this very important webinar together. And it's of course a privilege to be accompanied on this panel by the amazing speakers we've heard from today. We've spoken about a variety of important topics. And with the time that I've left, I'd like to touch on the concept of intersectionality, pushing a bit further on what Rudy introduced, and of course, what Olga mentioned as well. And since intersectionality as a strategy has been often successful for anti-Israel activists, and in particular, its manifestation in 2020, as we're continuing to witness the cries highlighting racial injustice, particularly in the United States, and of course, following the tragic murder of George Floyd earlier this year in May. However, I don't want to reiterate the same talking points that typically the pro-Israel world has resorted to for years, and don't get me wrong, these are very important points. However, and these typically involve highlighting the demonization of the Jewish state or offering a detailed explanation as to why a comparison is not merited in the first place, because the circumstances that are trying to be compared are simply apples and oranges. So during my time, I'd like to focus on the consequences that such a comparison can have on the Palestinian people, and in this particular scenario, the Black American community. On June 12th, an article published by the infamous and biased 972 magazine sought to promote the merging of Palestinian experiences to the ongoing protests throughout the United States that were calling for racial justice reform. The author, Gabriel Khoury, explained that the organizer of a June 6th protest in Washington, D.C., led the protesters in a chant, "From D.C. to Palestine, racist terror is a crime." Throughout the opinion piece, Khoury continually declares, on the issue of whether now is the time to connect Palestinian oppression with that of Black Americans, my answer is, we cannot afford to wait. This baseless attempt at intersectionality has the incredible ability to simultaneously rob Palestinian leaders of their agency and aid in the perpetuation of racial injustice that the Black community continues to experience. Look, the objection is not against the premise that the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and the Middle East are not suffering. I think that such a statement would be absurd. According to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, in fact, known as UNRWA, there's nearly 475,000 registered Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, of which 45% live in 12 of the country's refugee camps. In Syria, there's 552,000 registered Palestinian refugees and 9 refugee camps. In the Gaza Strip, there's more than 125 registered Palestinian refugees living in the Rafah refugee camp on the Gaza-Egyptian border. And in the West Bank, Palestinians continue to struggle with the hardships presented by Israeli security checkpoints. The system of oppression against the Palestinian people most certainly exists. It was one that had its beginnings with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who often was praised as the father of Palestinian nationalism, and who in 1937 urged Muslims in the Middle East to cleanse their lands of Jews, and openly collaborated with Nazi Germany to fuel the already existent institutionalized anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The system of oppression against the Palestinian people was furthered by Arab leaders who launched the war of extermination against Israel in 1948, a war that created hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees and whose descendants continue to be denied integration into the same countries responsible for initiating it. And as Israel sought peace with her neighbors amidst the anti-normalization policies of Arab countries, which eventually for Egypt and Jordan came to an end in 1979 and 1994, Yasser Arafat, the first president of the Palestinian Authority, ferociously assumed the role of chief Palestinian oppressor, one which would be shared by his successor, Mahmoud Abbas. And similar to Arafat, Abbas has spent his last decade and a half in power financing terrorism against Israel, accumulating personal wealth through sophisticated and corrupt schemes, and has systematically repressed any form of dissent or criticism against his dictatorship in the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, the US designated terrorist organization Hamas was democratically elected in 2006, although it's very difficult to say democratically elected. Since the establishment of the Hamas Covenant in 1988, which contains virulent anti-Semitic propaganda, the terrorist organization has indiscriminately fired thousands of rockets at Israeli civilian population centers, but even more than that, in recent days, failed attempts to launch rockets actually ended up costing the lives or limbs of Palestinian civilians living in the Gaza Strip. Virtually every aspect of Palestinian suffering can be attributed to decisions made by Palestinian and Arab leaders. Israel's military presence in the West Bank can be attributed to yet another failed attempt by Arab countries to launch another war of extermination intended to destroy the 19-year-old Jewish state back in 1967. Israel's dispersed network of security checkpoints throughout the West Bank can be attributed to years of Palestinian suicide bombings and indiscriminate attacks against Israeli civilians. All, if not most, were sponsored by the Palestinian leadership. The blockade around Gaza can be attributed to Hamas's genocidal rhetoric against the Jewish state. And the lack of Palestinian sovereignty can be attributed to the persistence of Palestinian leaders to turn down incredibly generous offers by the United Nations in 1947, which is known as Resolution 181, or by Israel in both 2000 with the Clinton parameters and again in 2008 with the Olmert peace plan. So yes, there is a system oppressing Palestinians, and it is at the hands of their own leaders. Consequentially, the attempt to intersect the ongoing fight for racial justice in America to the system of oppression that the Palestinian people are currently experiencing results in the whitewashing of crimes committed by Palestinian leaders against their own people for nearly the last century. It actually portrays Palestinian leaders as helpless victims who are trying to peddle through an oppressive system, and it ignores the fact that they were the chief architects of the current Palestinian reality. Accepting the absurd premise that the system suppressing Black Americans and Palestinians are linked not only dooms the Palestinian people to a future that offers little to no change from the current and difficult reality they're experiencing, but it also stains the ongoing movement for racial justice. The Black community in America did not choose this struggle. It did not initiate it, and it certainly did not have the opportunity to single-handedly end the fight for racial equality. Unlike the Palestinian leadership's decision to perpetuate the conflict with Israel, the Black community in America is trying to end it. George Floyd was not a Palestinian martyr, and Palestinian activists who are deeply interested in seeing their people's status quo change should have the courage to evaluate the role that their own leaders have played in the conflict's near century-old history. So in essence, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that demonizing the Jewish state is not only about demonizing the Jewish people and denying our rights to self-determination. Look, in the short term, yes, this does disproportionately affect the Jewish community, and we will viciously fight back. But demonizing the Jewish state comes at a cost, which is the blatant whitewashing of some of the world's most brutal and tyrannical dictatorships. And I am most certainly including Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in that axis of evil. And in doing so, dismissing some of the most heinous crimes against humanity that must be addressed by an international community that claims to be guided by a moral compass. Anti-Israel activism does not only lead to a crime against the Jewish people, but it leads to a crime against universal human rights. This means that in the fight against anti-Israel activism, I will not only rely on my fellow Jews, but on everyone and anyone who claims that they care about global human rights. For Jews and non-Jews alike, it is up to us to make this truth known. And I guess with that, I've cut into my 7 or 8 minutes.
Thank you, Yoni. Thanks a lot. Okay, just put you on mute. There we go. Hi, everyone. All right, so this brings us to our Q&A session. We've got a lot of really amazing questions coming in by email, on Zoom, and also through Facebook. And very excited to jump into it. So thank you, everyone, for your fantastic remarks. A lot of eye-opening details there, and reflections. So I'm just going to open this up to our panelists, and so keep your fingers ready on your unmute button, and we'll get going. But one really interesting question that we've got here is just taking a step back and looking at anti-Semitism, global anti-Semitism, and all its different facets and forms. How has it changed in the past few years, and what is anti-Semitism going to look like 5 years from now? So if anyone has any thoughts about the future, love to hear.
address. So first of all, I want to relate an experience that can maybe help conceptualize where we're going and what has happened in the past that we can relate to. When I did Marshall Living, which is a trip that I recommend every single Jew to do, to go to Poland and to see what happened during the Holocaust and to experience that with other groups of Jews and hopefully still Holocaust survivors, because we are the last generation that is going to be knowing Holocaust survivors. There was something that deeply frustrated me. Beyond the fact that for many of the Jewish people that came with me, it was a shock for them. Where for me, I grew up with the stories of the Holocaust. Half of my family was exterminated in the Holocaust. It was not shocking, but what for the most part shocked me was learning what the Jewish people didn't do prior to the rise of anti-Semitism. And a lot of people don't understand that it didn't go overnight from one moment we're living in Germany and a part of society to the next moment we're being put into gas chambers. There was a rise of anti-Semitism. And it started first by demonizing the Jewish people and then boycotting certain products, Kristallnacht, which was done by mostly students, putting yellow stars, then putting Jews in ghettos, and eventually led to what we know as 6 million people dying, Jewish people dying from the Holocaust. And my frustration was, what did the Jewish people do as anti-Semitism was rising? Because I understand that's their goal. Their goal is to eliminate us, to destroy us, as is the goal of racists and people that are anti-women to be other, anti those groups of people. What were the Jewish people doing about it? And I was going through different documents and different letters that different rabbis and Jewish leaders were saying, and the responses were almost identical to what I was hearing people making as excuses for why they weren't standing up against anti-Semitism on college campuses. And their answers were, don't worry about it, it'll just go away. If you do something, it'll just get worse. Or no, actually, we have to side with Hitler because what he wrote in Mein Kampf when he was in prison was just a crazy time that he had. Now, anyways, he's going to get into a position of power, so we have to side with him. And the answer to that is realizing after we say never again post the Shoah, is that we allow it to happen again. It was our responsibility to prevent it from happening. It's the responsibility of those that are anti-Black to be anti-Black, and it's the responsibility of people that are Black to fight against those movements and to create coalitions and to change the way pop culture sees things. So it's our responsibility as Jews to minimize anti-Semitism and to allow the society to recognize what is anti-Semitic and also educate people on how to fight back for that. Now, when it comes today, for young students, especially in the diaspora, especially I'm going to speak from my experience in the United States, most Jews are not taught about how to be Jews in practice. We're not taught how to debate, how to talk about Israel and Jewish history to the left and to the right, how to create coalitions, how to identify and fight against anti-Semitism. And if we ourselves cannot stand up against it, what do we expect the future to be? The future will look the same way that every single chapter of our history ended. And that's with some sort of persecution or extermination. So we can change that. And the way that we change that is by empowering the next generation to be ideologically and intellectually and also physically strong and aware, and creating coalitions within pop culture so that the society also minimizes anti-Semitism and keeps them away where they belong.
Thanks, Rudy. Does anyone else want to speak to that question about where are we going from here? What might anti-Semitism look like in the coming years?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. And what Rudy said was absolutely on point and fantastic. I think that every year that we see Israel continue to exist and continue to thrive, it's another year where we have the advantage over the fight against anti-Semitism. And the reason is Israel is the same country that proved that no matter where Eichmann was hiding in the world, he would be brought back to justice. And Israel is the same country that proved that if 102, 103 hostages were taken to a hostile country and the world would have moved a single finger to bring them back home, Israel would be there. That's Israel. Israel is the same country that provided a refuge to the tens of thousands of Yemenite Jews who were facing, some would say, certain death in the late 40s and early 50s. Every year that we continue to have Israel as a bastion for Jewish life is an advantage that we have over the fight for against anti-Semitism. But I do want to say that anti-Semitism, like a biological tumor, finds a way to adapt. right? In the communist revolution, Jews were labeled as greedy capitalists. And of course, when fascist Germany came along, Jews were labeled as the Bolsheviks. And in the ongoing fight for national liberation and social justice movements around the world, where countries were being welcomed left and right into the United Nations General Assembly and applauded for having achieved their dream of self-determination, the Jewish state was the only one that was labeled as a racist endeavor. And now that we see white supremacy on the rise, of course, we see the accusation that Jews are inherently white. And so it's important to level our expectations and understand that devoted anti-Semites will always find a way to adapt. But even more importantly, we have to recognize that Israel has given us the strength to fight back and push back against all of these heinous accusations. It's as if the birth of Israel all of a sudden fueled our voices to push back.
Avi, if I could also jump in, and with your permission at the same time. One, because it's a question that was asked, but then also two, in his answer, Rudy touched on it, and that's education. So Amanda asked, how do you suggest educating students? I, as a non-Jew, and somebody who comes from the African continent, not only see anti-Semitism in the ways that Yoni and Rudy have expressed, which I agree with, but also see it in the case of a growing sense of universalism. And that growing sense of universalism, if the education system, in terms of how we define anti-Semitism, how we teach both Jewish students as well as non-Jewish students what anti-Semitism is, we're going to find ourselves in trouble. What do I mean? And I say this with the utmost respect. Oftentimes when you see anti-Semitism being addressed, you see it couched in these terms in the hope to include everybody, in the hope not to offend. So you see the term no hate, and you see the term no bigotry, and you see the term no racism. But if we just look at that, I, as a non-Jew and as a Black person, if I were to experience anything to do with racism, I could raise my hand up and go, oh, but I've just now experienced something that's anti-Semitic. And so what that then does is that gives credence, it then gives courage to people whose ultimate goal is the destruction of not only the Jewish state, but also the Jewish diaspora. It gives them the courage to be like, well, because everybody's not jumping on this bandwagon and we're using it as a smokescreen against our ultimate goal, we will then see this then morph into something that's going to become even more dangerous. Now, as I mentioned in my talk, at the end of it, anti-Semitism, as history has told us time and time again, doesn't only end with the Jews. Oftentimes, many people, when they talk about refugees, they only talk about the Palestinian refugees, but they forget about the 850,000 Jewish refugees that came from different parts of the world, including Middle East and North Africa. And if we see what happened in those countries where the Jews were then expelled, the people that then suffered immediately after those Jewish people were oppressed and were persecuted were the Christians and were other groups of minorities. So anti-Semitism needs to be dealt with in terms of its ugliness. And in terms of education, I'm very proud to not only do work with DEISI International that has its primary work done in Africa, but also here in the United States with an organization called Club Z. And I would say to anybody, and I say so unashamedly, anybody who has a high school student who's Jewish to sign up for Club ZY, because the method in which the education is done, and I have very high respect for not only our founder, but the people that I'm so privileged to work with, is addressing these issues head on. There's no sugarcoating, it's calling it what it is so that, as Rudy so eloquently expressed, our youngsters are able to eloquently as well as intelligently address this ideology for what it is.
Thanks, Olga. I have a question that that a few people have been asking in different forms, and love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. And David, you might have a unique perspective. So for those watching at home, a common question we've been hearing today is, what's some practical advice that anyone here, can offer so they can take what they learned today and actually put it into constructive practice? Some practical steps people could do beginning right away to address anti-Semitism in their midst. And of course, one very pervasive form we've been seeing is coming from the progressive left, something that David studied and examined very carefully. So what can we do as individuals? We're not all, activists. in any formal way, what can the layman do?
So I think there's something quite important really underlying our understanding of anti-Semitism, and that is that anti-Semitism isn't true, right? Anti-Semitism doesn't intervene in events in the real world. Anti-Semitism looks at events in the real world and shapes them into an anti-Semitic narrative. And I think it's quite important because a lot has been said about Israel and Palestine and the history of the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I think that's very important. But I think that the Zionism which anti-Zionism hates doesn't really have anything to do with actual Zionism and the history and the diversity of Zionism. In fact, we can talk about the discussion about hyphens, right? Most scholars of anti-Semitism write it without the hyphen because there is no Semitism which anti-Semitism opposes, right? Anti-Semitism constructs the Jews and it pretends that the Jews are all sorts of things that it wants to oppose. And I think it's about time we stopped writing anti-Zionism with a hyphen too. I write it without a hyphen. And the reason for that is because the Zionism, which is constructed by anti-Zionists, bears very, very little relation to the actual state of Israel and the power politics of the Middle East and the Sunni-Shia divide and the material conflicts which are real and which rage across the Middle East. So I think we need to be clear. Firstly, we need to be clear about when a critique of something, this or that Israel might do, we need to be clear when that is a kind of legitimate critique or when it's an anti-Semitic understanding. When Israel is transformed, the actual conflict which exists between the Israelis and the Palestinians is transformed in the imagination into something which puts the Israelis at the very center of all world history. And that's what the problem with connecting the Palestinians to the Black Lives Matter movement is that in reality, what it tends to do is to position Israel and the Jews as being centrally responsible for the killing of Black men in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. Anti-Semitism always constructed the Jews as being central to everything bad in the world, and anti-Zionism tends to do the same, and when it does, we need to worry about it. So I'm not convinced that we should respond to people saying Israel is terrible by saying, oh, actually, Israel is great. Because it's kind of not the point. In 1930s Germany, if somebody said, look, the Jews are bankers, we wouldn't respond by saying, yes, but bankers are really great. Or if somebody said Jews are pornographers, we wouldn't say, yeah, but pornographers are okay. Or if somebody said Jews are Bolsheviks or Jews are fine, you know, whatever, we would say your politics, your anti-democratic politics is using an anti-Semitic notion of the Jews to create a movement here in Germany, here in Britain, here in America. So one of the things I want to do is to decouple the ways in which people talk about and think about Jewish identity in the Middle East from the anti-Semitic ways in which it's done. And I'll just finish by making that point clearer, if I may, that there's a big difference, right? If we all have our own identities which we have and which we create and which are created for us, right? I may or may not have a very nice, empowering identity as a Jew. But if I'm walking down the street late at night and a bunch of anti-Semites construct me from outside as a Jew, then that identity construction is very little to do with my own self-empowering identity. And something similar happens in politics, right? So a Jewish person in a trade union or in a student union may or may not have their own politics to do with Israel and Palestine and to do with Zionism, but they are constructed in a hostile way and from outside as Zionist. And you might think, well, fine, Zionism is fine. But the meaning of the Zionism with which they are constructed is racism, apartheid, imperialism. So when people have their identity constructed for them, the answer is to say, don't construct my identity for me. It's not to say, oh yes, you're right to construct me in that way, but actually it has a different meaning for me. The meaning I have, I can talk about when I like, and I will, and it's important to me. But if you define me as Jewish or Black or gay or trans while I'm walking down the street in a hostile way and it endangers me, then just butt out.
Yeah, Avi, if it's possible, I just want to add one more thing because I know we're getting close to the time. I think it's very important to say that not every bigoted comment defines someone as a bigot, right? And so oftentimes when we assume these negative intentions, that often shuts a window down to engage in meaningful dialogue that can actually lead to a fruitful conversation, and then eventually overcoming that person's particular perspective on a particular group of people. And so our first reaction should be in the fight against anti-Semitism to try to assume positive intentions when possible, and to try to engage in meaningful dialogue and offer any and all resources for education. And we have to continue to believe, as Anna Frank used to say, that people are good at heart, and try to engage in these conversations that can lead to, hopefully, I dream, the eventual demise of anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Some inspiring words. So I know we hit the hour, just in conversation with our co-organizer, Chloe here. I mean, we're happy to go a few minutes over. We want to make sure these really important issues are addressed. Some of our panelists have been receiving directly at them some questions in the chat here. If any of you see that and want to respond directly, this is a great opportunity. Otherwise, got plenty of more general questions for our esteemed panelists. If you'd unmute yourselves. Okay, so we kind of spoke to this, and David sort of got this going, this idea of, what are some critical changes we need to make in order to be more effective in terms of our advocacy, which kind of builds off the earlier question. And, there's a lot to consider there. There's a lot to unpack. Of course, it's very easy to fall into the trap where we use messaging and information and arguments that resonate with us because we might believe in them, but don't necessarily resonate with the audience that we need to reach. And that's a common trap. But I'm wondering, just, in the time that we have, if there's, asking our panelists if there's some critical changes that need to be made, should be made in your mind, in order to kind of give us a strong leap forward in terms of how we are effective advocates when it comes to anti-Semitism. Would love to pick your brains.
I can address that. Well, it's kind of related to the previous question, but I think that the question we need to ask ourselves is both individual and collective. How can we make this world a better place? How can we fight against anti-Semitism? How can we educate ourselves? And you can do it to yourself, but we also have to have a conversation of how do we do it on a larger macro scale for our next generation, giving the tools, ability to identify, know our history, debate skills, public speaking skills. These are not things that are taught to our younger generation of Jews through Jewish institutions, day schools, summer camps, synagogues, Chabad houses, API houses, Hillels, whatever it may be. They teach Jews how to go and congregate in their safe spaces, but not how to go out and take action. So the analogy I would give to what's going on a college campus is you have two sports teams. You have Team Israel, the Jewish people, and Team Anti-Israel, anti the Jewish people. And Team Anti-Israel, anti the Jewish people is practicing every day, recruiting the best players, the best coaches, the best trainers, the best facility, everything in order to win the championship. And Team Israel is on the sideline bench talking about how their jerseys are made with Israeli technology and complaining to each other while whispering to each other. And then we ask ourselves, why is the situation that Team Anti-Israel is winning? Well, it's because we're not playing. So in order to move forward, I think we need to focus on three things: empower, educate, and expose. What that means first by empowerment, it means educate yourself, learn how to gain skills or use the skills that you have. For example, if you have the skills to do public speaking, use that. If you have the skills to write books, do that. If you have the skills to create paintings and artworks to communicate messages, use that. Use the talents and skills that you have. Obtain new skills as you go. For example, public speaking was not something that I was born with. It is something that I've had to develop. Naturally, I'm very introverted. So I had to develop that skill in order to fulfill a need that I saw in the micro problems in the community of Columbia University and other places where I dealt with anti-Semitism on college campuses. So empower. When it comes to narrate, it touches to the second point that you're making. We need to be able to speak the language of our audience. If I'm in business and I'm selling a product in Spain, I'm going to speak in Spanish. If I move that business or want to sell that product in America, I need to speak in English. So when it comes to college campuses and the younger generation and the future political and intellectual class of the world, we need to be able to speak in a language that they understand. So if you talk about Israel in terms of facts, the Balfour Declaration, the partition plan, the war in 48, the war in 67, all the peace accords, that only gets you so far. And it kind of goes right above the heads of most students. They need to be able to hear a story that they can connect to on an emotional level, a story that they can feel good about themselves for supporting and relating to. So the story of Israel is not the story of cherry tomatoes, ways, drip irrigation, cherry tomatoes, and all these cool things that Israel's created, although that is a part of the story. I think the fundamental narration of our story is a story of a 4,000-year-old native population from the land of Israel, Judea, that was forcefully and brutally displaced from their native homeland by a Western white imperial nation called the Romans. During their displacement, they even maintained a constant presence in their homeland. There was never a time in history without Jews there. And after 2,000 years of extermination, oppression, and persecution, we eventually created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed. But for the first time in history, a native people revived their civilization, kicked out the oppressive colonial force at the time being the British, and also for the first and only time in history, revived the dead language. And when you tell Israel in that story, the story of the Jewish people, then students understand why Israel has a right to exist. The fundamental question on campus is, who are the Jewish people and why does Israel have a right to exist? And instead of countering the counter movement, BDS, anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, they're all different branches of the same tree. And it's a movement countering our right to exist, countering our identity. And we're focused on countering the counter movement rather than lifting our own movement up. The last point is to expose. We need to be able to go to those spaces and expose bad ideas for being bad ideas and break the coalitions that they have. I can give a very quick example about that. As we said earlier that most of the panelists spoke about, intersectionality is something being used on college campuses to get other communities to the conclusion that the Jewish people and Israel is the bad guy and the similar bad guy in our narrative and in our story. And one of the events or one of the movements and things being said today on college campuses is about pinkwashing. For those who haven't heard pinkwashing, it's this idea that Israel gives rights to live for people that are LGBTQ+ in order to wash away the crimes that they commit against Palestinians. And anyone that knows the truth about Israel, has lived here, would find this not only ridiculous, but deeply offensive, especially if someone was LGBTQ+. And at this event, they had the speaker talking about a whole lot of things, and we did 3 things to disrupt the event and to expose it. The first thing is we created flyers that said all the counter information that they were about to present and handed it out to everyone walking in. So as all the students walked in before they even heard the event, they were reading all the counterpoints. The second thing that we did is we created these big posters that said false, lies, anti-Semitism, and inaccurate. And every time the speaker said something that was false, a lie, inaccurate, or anti-Semitic, we lifted those signs up. Now we were standing in the back of the class, so we were not preventing anyone from seeing, so we're not actually disrupting the event. But in a way, every time we lifted those signs up, the people in the middle, all the audience would turn back and associate lies, false, and anti-Semitic to what the speaker was saying, and was also throwing off the speaker completely in their flow. And the last thing that we did in order to really expose them and eventually break the coalition between the LGBTQ+ group and the anti-Israel group was we asked a series of questions. And we asked the speaker, excuse me, Mahmoud Ishrawi was a Palestinian militant member of Hamas. They found out that he was gay and they shot him 3 bullets to the chest. Will you condemn it? Well, it's not our job to talk about Hamas. Let me repeat it. Mahmoud Ishrawi was a Palestinian militant member of Hamas, and they found out that he was gay and they shot him 3 bullets in the chest for being a gay Palestinian. Will you condemn it? No, it's not our job. So how dare you talk about LGBTQ plus rights, and talk about Palestinian rights. The people who are doing the real pink washing is you. You are using and abusing the suffering of real human beings in order to manipulate that and use that as political ammunition to attack another people, and are actually a part of the fuel that creates this conflict. They had nothing to say. We filmed all that on tape, showed it to the LGBTQ plus group the next day, and they broke their coalition. So we need to be able to also go into these spaces and expose them for what they are and get the culture of a society. If it's in a micro space, the culture on college campuses, to understand why these things are anti-Semitic, why these things are problematic, and also lead people into teaching them how do we fight against them.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Rudy. So it looks like that's our time. I want to thank our speakers for joining us today, and to everyone online for your participation and great questions. Thank you to Chloe for organizing the event. And you're all invited to check out International Voices for Change on Twitter and Instagram, and combatantisemitism.org, along with Cam's social media channels. Also, I want to invite you to a special event, and I'm just going to throw this up on the screen here so you can check it out. And we're very excited about this. This is coming up in about 2 weeks' time. It's the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, 11 examples, 11 stories. This will be September 16th, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern. This is going to be a live studio event. It'll feature the 11 examples of modern anti-Semitism as defined by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition. And it'll be accompanied by some VIP speakers, as well as 11 unique corresponding real stories from victims of anti-Semitism as shared by them on the program by video. And it's really going to bring this IRA definition to life. So if you want to check that out, visit our website, but also to see the event live on YouTube, you just need to remember this simple URL. It is tinyurl.com/IHRA event. Again, that's tinyurl.com/IHRA event. And that'll take you right to the live page. So thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks so much.